In this episode, I interview Cindy Raquet, who co-wrote this book, Purposeful and Persistent Parenting, with her husband, John. And they go over what does biblical parenting look like and give so many practical advice and tips for raising children. They have 8 children of their own, 4 are grown and 4 are still in the home. And they wrote this book because they were asked many times for advice and thought they should put it all in one place. So I hope that you enjoy this and that it is encouraging to you. So let's get into the interview. Hello, thank you for joining us on Fruitful Homemaker. I have with me today Cindy Raquet, and she and her husband wrote Purposeful and Persistent Parenting, Blessing Others, Blue Tape Boundaries, and Other Practical Perspectives on Raising Children. So thank you, Cindy, for joining me today. Would you introduce yourself a little bit?
Thank you for having me, Emily.
Yes.
My name is Cindy Raquet. I live in a suburb of Dayton, Ohio, with my husband and 4 of my 8 children. Right now, we're blessed to have all of our other children still in the area with their families, and that's who I am.
That's great.
A sinner saved by grace, worship in a Reformed Baptist church here.
Oh, that's great. So this book has been so influential in our parenting. What led you and your husband to write this book? I remember reading that it was a multi-year project, and you can tell just with the depth and the wisdom involved, it is just wonderfully written.
Thank you. Well, several people over a long period of time had suggested that we would write a book, and we tend to laugh that off, thinking that it was something we would never do, that we would never prioritize. But over the years, we were blessed with many college students, probably over a couple decades in our home, a lot of the time when our children were young. And as these college students married and began raising children of their own, we started to get more calls and emails with questions specifically about parenting, since they were in our home when we were very actively parenting multiple ages of children. We also received a lot of texts and emails and calls from Air Force families that we had been stationed with when we had moved around within the Air Force. And so about 7 years ago, my husband, on a drive out to Colorado when it was just he and I, he said, I want you to think about something. I wonder if we should try writing a book, even if it's only for our own children, before they start their parenting. But basically, he thought it would be more efficient to have answers to frequently asked questions all in one place with prayerfully thought out replies, rather than just custom answering emails and texts when you might not be as careful or well thorough or well thought out. And another reason he suggested we write a book is that a lot of the questions we received about parenting were very practical in nature, very rubber meets the road type questions, like what do you do about whining, or how can mealtime with my young children be a more pleasant experience because it's kind of stressful. And a lot of the resources that we were aware of, that we were comfortable recommending to others, were more about important parenting principles from the scriptures, but not as easily applicable as we would like to those types of questions. Another reason we wanted to write it all down, even just for our own children, is we felt like we made a lot of mistakes in the beginning. We did a lot of things what we thought is the hard way, and reaped the fruit of that, and wanted to spare our children some of those pitfalls.
Oh, that's great. Yes, there is so much wisdom here, so much scripture, and so much practical advice. I feel like any question that I had, there was a chapter on it. Like you mentioned, the whining, even sitting still in church. All of those are so important, and they're all in one place. So, one of the first chapters is grace-filled parenting. Will you explain that a little bit?
I think a lot of people might have a different, if you just said grace-filled parenting, they might define that differently, but I'll try to explain what I mean by that. It's trying to strike a healthy balance in our own hearts and minds between the call on our lives to obey the Lord and our children's call to obey their parents in the Lord. And on the other side, a recognition that we're all sinners who need God's grace. And those of us that are His are so thankful we received that grace and mercy that we didn't deserve. So you have these two things that can be in tension sometimes. Depending on your background, you may struggle to be more focused on law and obedience, or you may struggle with being all about grace and mercy and not requiring obedience. But we're actually called to be like our Heavenly Father in this, being full of mercy and grace and yet requiring obedience. So both things at once. So just as our standing before our Father is not based on our performance, but on Christ's work, because we could never stand before God based on our merits, we need to remember that our children are natural born sinners and are going to struggle with sin. And our relationship with them can't be based on their performance. Just like we've been forgiven a huge debt, we need to respond to our children as fellow sinners who understand that struggle to obey God in everything, that it's hard and that we need the Lord to do that. Just like our children, we often put our own enjoyment or short-term pleasure ahead of what those in authority over us, even our Heavenly Father, has asked us to do. And our children are younger. They're less mature, less practiced in self-control and obedience, and less able with experience to utilize the means of grace to flee sin than we as adults would be. So surely we should respond with grace to our children's ongoing struggle with sin. I think it can be really easy when our children, we're really tired and we're trying to get a lot of necessary things done, and our children disobey or sin against us. We can feel like it's a personal thing. This is, I shouldn't be treated this way. And I mean, big picture, yes, we shouldn't be, but we shouldn't be surprised that our children struggle with selfishness and sin and lacking self-control. And so we need to call them to obedience and hold the line, have a bar, a standard, but we need to respond with compassionate grace, saying, oh, it's so hard to obey, isn't it? And, come alongside and point them to Christ.
Yes,
Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, that's what I loved about this chapter. I have underlined so much in this book, but I love that you really balance that well of that we need to have grace in our parenting, grace-filled parenting, and yet also require obedience, and that there's the balance of being grace-filled and also, like you said here, we want the point that even though our relationship with God is based on grace, it doesn't negate the importance of our obeying Him. Likewise, being grace-filled parents does not negate the importance of our children learning to obey us. So this has been just such a wonderful chapter that I read often about just making sure that we're filled with grace. So you talked about Proverbs 14:4 and how that was an encouragement to you while raising children. Will you explain why that had such an impact on you?
Yeah, so I'm the sort of person who really likes order and predictability and uncluttered surfaces in my home. But raising children, especially several small children at one time, can make predictability, order, tidiness not a regular thing you can come to expect, right? So I wanted to have a really thankful heart for the blessings I was surrounded by, even if all I seemed to do was wipe noses and faces and change diapers and cook and clean up the next meal and just kind of start that cycle over, add some laundry in there. Um, And so that was a struggle because I wanted to be thankful, but I just would get really irritated by the clutter. And one day during my devotional time, Proverbs 14:4 really struck me. And the version I was reading said, "Where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox." And, children do cause messes, but they will grow to be a mighty force for good if God would bless in that way. And I wanted eyes to see beyond the messes and continual cleanup operation that I felt like I was in the middle of at the time. So by God's grace, one day while that verse was on my mind, I just turned that verse into a little jingle just to sing it and keep it constantly on my mind. And I apparently sang it quite a bit because my baby at the time, which was my fifth child, I think she thought it was her song because if I would start to sing it, she would just sort of wiggle around and dance like it was her little theme song. And she wasn't really the one making the messes. It was the four older children. But if you think about it, if you're a farmer, you could have a very tidy barn and feeding trough. It could be beautiful, pristine, but it would mean that you don't have an ox there to do the
Mhm.
plowing or harvesting of your food.
Mhm.
If you have an ox, you get a lot of necessary work and help from that ox, but there is the side effect that you're going to have a barn and a feeding trough that's not going to stay clean and going to need constant attention. And so it's the same thing with young children. It just takes that long-term perspective because with an ox, you have maybe the seasonal work you get out of your ox, but with your children, it's a 18, 20-year project from birth to when you maybe are seeing how God is going to use them to impact the world.
Mhm.
So moms of young ones, take courage. When everyone's under 5, you are doing most of the physical work that needs to be done. But as your children grow, they take on more chores, and you'll be amazed at how your children can multiply your impact.
Mhm.
It didn't take long before I was caring for the baby, and someone else was making lunch in the kitchen, and someone else was doing the laundry, and someone else was out mowing the grass, and someone else was preparing a meal for someone who just adopted several children. And I could never
Wow.
do all of that at once by myself.
Mhm.
And there were a couple times I was like, wow, think about it. Like, by God's grace, I have been multiplied, but it doesn't seem that way when everyone's under 5.
Right. It is hard work. So I wanted to ask if you feel comfortable, how did the jingle go? Because I was reading the passage and thinking, how did she do that? How did she make it a song?
Okay, so I'm not a very good singer, but I'll try my best. Where no oxen are, the manger is clean, but much increase comes by the strength of an ox. Proverbs 14:4. Proverbs 14:4. Where no ox. It just kind of
Oh,
repeats and repeats like that.
oh, that's great. Oh, I will be using that. That is wonderful. Thank you. So, why should we refrain from verbally complaining about our children?
Okay, that's a good question. Just like it doesn't make sense to complain about other blessings that God has given us, right? Think about Numbers
Mhm.
11 when the Israelites are complaining about the incredible provision and blessing that manna was to them. Um, it's really an affront to our God to complain about the good gifts that He gives us. I mean, even in our culture, it's very common for women to complain about their husbands or,
Mhm.
people to complain about their jobs. And in some sense, these are our provisions God has given us, blessings He's given us. But complaining about children also isn't helping our hearts, our minds, because
Mhm.
or those around us to see our children as the blessings that they are. We're sort of rather than thinking on something that's edifying, right, pure, of good repute, excellent, praiseworthy, we're playing an unhelpful jingle in our heads and poisoning those around us as well. It's sort of like back in my
Mhm.
day, we would call it playing the same tape, but now
Mhm.
maybe
Yeah.
MP3s or something. But you could just sort of rehearse over and over again a complaining thought, and it just sort of snowballs and becomes bigger. And if you think about it, it's also really devastating if you were complaining about your children and they weren't listening, and maybe you
Mhm.
didn't think they were. It would be really hard for us as adults to deal with our spouse complaining about us in public.
Mm-hmm.
imagine what that would be like for a child, even harder for them to deal with because, they might not have the understanding about how common of a sin that might be. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but sadly, that's a really common occurrence in our culture. It's really cool to complain about your children or teens. And I know some of you listening may have experienced losses. I know we've had several miscarriages, and I can remember some of the most painful things were
Mm-hmm.
hearing people nearby say how scared they were that they might be pregnant. And I was thinking, I would do anything to, if the Lord would give me a child right now, so
Mm-hmm.
we need to be careful about when we're complaining. It could really have a negative effect on the people around us that we may not be thinking about, not just poison our own souls, but really be hard on those um, around us. I want to say that I know there's times when it's right and good to share your parenting struggles with others. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's not that it would never be appropriate to say, wow, I'm really having a hard time with this area of parenting, and to seek wise counsel from others, or just ask others to pray that you would have some wisdom and some breakthrough in that area, and have them offer you their encouragement and accountability. But that's very different than just complaining.
Well, and for a time, your children are listening, but they can't verbally communicate to you, back what you're saying. And
Right,
even with my
right.
daughter, Gracie, today, she's 4, and we had just recently went to the doctor, and she was playing doctor here, and she puts the blood pressure cuff on my arm, and she says, okay, this is going to squeeze, but it'll be like a little hug. And that was something the nurse had said, and I didn't even remember
Right,
that she said it, but it really stuck with her that this is going to be a little
right,
hug. And it just reminded me of how what we're saying and talking about, they're listening. And now she's playing
right.
back things that she hears. But that happens
Yes,
much earlier of them listening, but they're not communicating it back. I
right.
um, it stuck with me in the book you and your husband wrote, if God himself, who created this child and gave them to me, were standing right here before me, would it be appropriate for me to say this? We would suggest that if the answer is no, it shouldn't be said. And so I think about that often of if the Lord was
Mm.
here, would this be appropriate? And so, yes, that has been something I think of often. And let's see,
He is the
why?
God who sees, and the God I'm sorry. He is
Oh,
the God who sees and the God who hears, right? So it's not like he's ever
absolutely.
not listening.
That's right. What are our distinct roles as a parent and for our children? What are their roles?
Um, the scriptures teach a few very clear distinctions. Parents are instructed to teach their children diligently and to discipline them, like in Deuteronomy 6 and many places in Proverbs. Children are instructed to obey their parents in the Lord, for this is right, in Ephesians 6, and they're also instructed to honor their parents. So, yes, we're all in one family, and some people like to think of family as like a team, and
Mhm.
that's true, but the team has special player, like there's coaches, there's players, there's different roles
Right.
within the team. Um, but the one another's in scripture do apply in a general sense, like we need to treat one another in all the one another's of scripture. But I think a lot of parents in our cultural moment can lack confidence to require obedience or to teach and train diligently. And they just kind of adopt this team motif a little bit too strongly, where we're all just team members. There's not specific, distinct roles. Um, if you think about it, how are our children supposed to obey us unless we train them how? They're
Mhm.
not going to be born with that skill or that understanding. So they need to be taught what obedience looks like and how to do it. I think we can just expect, well, God commands it, so they should, but it's
Mhm.
actually something that needs to be explained, demonstrated. What does obedience look like? What does obedience not look like? Things like that.
Yes, that
Um,
that is great. That um, is so helpful to remember that our children, we have authority over them, and that's a good thing. And just to remember the scriptures and that our roles as parents and our roles that our children have. Why should a parent's primary concern be for the hearts of our children and not just their external behavior?
That's a good question. Ultimately, what we are concerned about is that what our child's heart is before the Lord. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. We could settle for feigned compliance and raise a bunch of little Pharisees quite easily, where we just expect a certain behavior, and no matter how grumbly they are inside, it looks like obedience if you're not looking too closely, right? They could act like they're obeying us, but and look like maybe they're obeying God, but actually, if they're walking around like little Pharisees, they're actually in the process of hardening their hearts. One of our goals is for our children to respond to God-given authorities with respect as they grow older, and ultimately for them to respond to the ultimate authority, God, with a respect-filled obedience. And so we're very concerned about what we would call heart maintenance, trying to address the issues of the heart and trying to make sure that we're not just getting pretend compliance with the rules that we have.
That is so true. And it's something we need to think often as parents is my child doing this, what I asked of them, just out of pure duty? Or are they doing it joyfully? And if they're not, we should stop and say, and talk with them about it. What's going on inside? Why are we grumbling about this? Because it can be so easy to just go through our day and just wanting pure obedience, but we need to get to their heart. That's the most important thing, is that their heart is for the Lord. And so it can be a little intimidating at times, just to stop and remember. One of my prayers is that I would see that in my children. If something is going on in the heart, that no matter what's going on, that we stop and we take care of it, because it's just so important. Let's
And
see.
really stopping and leading them through some questions to try to get at where the struggle is. Like it's usually an idol of some kind, and trying to find out, well, what's more important to you right now than obeying mom? What is it that you really want? Because it takes a lot of work for us to recognize the idols in our hearts. So they need our help to sort of recognize where the struggle is.
Right. Our hearts are idol factories. We're constantly searching for that next idol. And yes, we absolutely have to be looking for that in our children's hearts. And so this leads us to consistency. And why is it important for us to be consistent with our children?
Well, one of the commands for parents in the scriptures is not to exasperate our children. And yet, I think being inconsistent with our expectations for our children and having inconsistent expectations between parents is a surefire way to exasperate your children. In a sense, it's not treating them the way we would want to be treated, right? Jesus teaches that we would, do unto others as we would have them do unto us, right? We want to be treated consistently, and we get really frustrated when authorities in our lives seem unpredictable or capricious in how they administer justice or carry out the responsibilities that they have. So I know this is a really hard thing to do, to be consistent, especially if your parenting style tends to be a bit more spontaneous or off the cuff. You have to be real thoughtful and purposeful to be consistent. But it's worth doing, because I think it's very hard for our children to function under inconsistency. So there's lots of ways we can be inconsistent. We can be inconsistent in terms of how we respond to their disobedience. Some days being very prompt and consistent, very prompt and applying the standard that we've set in our household, and other days just pretending not to notice it, or them knowing that we noticed it and let it go. That's one way to be inconsistent. Parents can be inconsistent between each other, where one parent expects a certain standard and the other parent doesn't, and kids pick up on that real quick, and they know
Yes.
which parent to ask which questions to if that's what you're doing. Or we can be inconsistent between how we act in public versus how we act in the privacy of our own homes, which I
Mm-hmm.
think is also dangerous, because that's sort of teaching our kids that duplicity is a good thing, which doesn't really make a lot of sense.
One section of your book that I found helpful was what you had mentioned, consistency between what you say and what you do. So you teach your children not to lie,
Mm,
but you tell the telemarketer you're not home. Or you instruct them it's wrong to steal, but they watch as you fail to return a product to the store. You lecture your children that it's wrong to lash out at other people in anger when they're upset, but they watch you lose your temper over a bad call at a baseball game. And you go over if we respond in a sinful outburst, in an angry outburst, that, well, I'm sure you could elaborate on this, but we admit that we sinned and ask for forgiveness. Thank the Lord for his forgiveness and seek his help to overcome sinful anger when we are tempted. And ultimately, showing the heart of the gospel to our children and just how important that is.
mhm,
And so I found that just very helpful, and especially with the anger, because or at least my daughter is 4 and my son is almost 3, and they can bicker very easily. And so, you're constantly, seems like, telling them,
mm,
don't be angry with one another, but you can easily be angry while you're driving or something happens. And so you really have to check your own heart as you're checking
mhm,
their hearts.
mhm.
Uh, and then, so you have the blue tape on the cover of your book. So will you talk about how the blue tape has helped your family?
So, as I've alluded to, we really changed our parenting approach between when our first child was born and when our third child was born.
Mm.
And we had moved houses shortly before our third child was born. And our kitchen in that house seemed like a particularly dangerous place for a crawling baby or toddling toddler. It had some blind corners with a very tall but thin island in the middle. So I felt like I could be turning corners and stepping over a child if I had allowed my baby to climb in there. But there wasn't really a good place to put a gate. And
Mm-hmm.
there was a clear boundary, however. The carpet ended and the vinyl began before it was a dangerous part of the kitchen. So we thought, I wonder if we could teach a crawling baby not to cross this line. It was just a crazy thought that we had. And it's actually pretty surprising that it's easy to teach a crawling baby boundaries.
Mm.
We tend to be very permissive of crawling babies and then suddenly very restrictive of
Mm.
3-year-olds, or like we
Mm-hmm.
but if you just start early on and say, no, you can't cross here, and maybe just tap their hand, no, just it's worked very well on all of our subsequent 6 children. um, it worked so well that we started to imagine other ways that we could bring a little bit of sanity into our home by limiting the area that a crawling or toddling child expected that they were allowed to go.
Mm-hmm.
If there wasn't a clear carpet or vinyl line, we started to use masking tape, like at the bottom of the stairs or like a few feet away from the top of the stairs. And that worked really well until we were getting ready to move out of that house. And we realized
Mm-hmm.
masking tape is very hard to remove from some surfaces like carpeting. And so after that experience, after tape that had been walked on for 2 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
we transitioned over to blue tape, which is painter's
Mm.
tape. It still can be challenging to remove after a couple years, but it's much easier to remove. And actually, it comes in lots of other colors too. We have some friends who have kind of adopted this boundary
Mm-hmm.
method, and they have different colors for different young children in their family, because maybe maybe, the baby has more restrictions than maybe the 3-year-old or
Oh,
something like
right.
that.
Well, I thought it was just wonderful advice in your book. And near the end of the chapter, you and your husband say that learning the skill of functioning within boundaries is an essential part of everyday life. So when you're starting young, you're just building that foundation that boundaries are a good thing.
And
All
we
right.
all have them. The Lord has given us
Yes,
gracious boundaries to keep us in a good place. So
absolutely. Next is chores. So what impact does chores have for raising a responsible child and to show them that they're important to the family?
I think chores are amazing and definitely underrated. We were obviously made to work before the fall. We were given tasks to do. And young children are actually quite tickled to be given responsibilities to help the family. I think it's just on our natural instinct to give a 2 and 3-year-old some responsible chore because we think it's going to take too long and it's going to be messy and it's really not going to help that much. But it helps a lot because it's the beginning of training them of the value of work and how they can help their family that way. Yes, it takes training, but the payoff is great. And yes, some plates will probably get broken as you transition a new child to dish duty. That's
Mhm.
definitely happened in our family. But again, I think the overall gain is tremendous and very worthwhile. Chores can give your children a legitimate understanding of their important role in the family, how they have something to contribute, how they can be a significant help, and they learn lifelong skills of responsibility. And it was really funny. During those 7 years, I heard of a study where some social scientists found that the best predictor of a young adult's success in their mid 20s, and by success, they meant like not on drugs, has a job, or is in school. They had a lot of different qualifiers of what was success. Um, they said the single best predictor of success in their mid 20s was that they had participated in household tasks for where others were depending on their work when they were 3 or 4 years old. And
Wow.
I loved hearing that because I feel like that is a time when our children should be sharing some work in our household, but it's just so counter what we would think that would have such a big impact. Um, One of the best things I think about chores is that it gives us a very legitimate thing about which to praise our children to
Mhm.
their faces in front of the rest of the family, but also to grandparents. You can get on the phone, hey, guess what Junior did today?
Mhm.
And your child will just beam with joy. Friends, neighbors, people at church, you can just brag on that 2 or 3-year-old
Right.
legitimately for the good work that they did folding those washcloths. And they're just delighted. I had a friend send me a video of her 3-year-old loading the washing machine. And he was
Mm.
just so excited that he had this job to put all the clothes in the washer. It's a better time to teach chores, I think, than to wait until they're 6 or 7 and then say, okay, now you have to work.
Yes, I just read also Mary Beakey's book, Teach Them to Work. And it's about having your children start work in the home and that it's a good thing and that it does help um, show them that they are responsible and that they are important to the family. And I know with our kids now they enjoy unloading the dishwasher. And like you said, dishes get broke. and but it's okay. And it's also a good opportunity to not make a big deal out of something that's really not a big deal. So if they break a plate, it's, oh, let's clean it up. We can buy another one,
Hmm.
and they enjoy it. Uh, Gracie, she loves to fold the clothes, and it's just been such a joy to see her enjoy to work and helping her brother fold his clothes because he can't really do all of the folding yet. And so it's been wonderful in our home to implement chores and have it be part of the family. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cindy, for your wisdom from your book. And there's so much more wisdom to be had, to be learned from you. So we hope to do more episodes about your book and the other chapters that you and your husband have written. The last question that I have is for what I call fruit for your home. What is one recipe that your family loves that you guys cook or is special that maybe your kids now cook? Would you share that with us?
Sure. And thank you, Emily, for having me. This is
Of
this
course.
is a real privilege. Probably the easiest, least expensive meal that my children all loved when they were younger was something created by friends of ours when they were trying to think of something that was gluten and dairy free that they could feed us when we visited them. And we call it butler beans because that was the name of the family that created this recipe. So basically, it's like the simplest meal ever. So you just take baking potatoes and load them in your oven on a timer if you can, so you can do it early in the day. And then put dried beans in your crock pot or instant pot, whatever kind of dried beans your family prefers. I think we tended to use red beans for this recipe, but we've tried it with other beans. And then mix up your favorite salad dressing or use your favorite bottled salad dressing. We tend to use a type of vinaigrette or honey mustard type dressing for this, but you could use really any dressing that your family enjoys. And then you combine them all. It's just serve the potatoes mashed on the plate with some mostly drained beans. You want a little bit of bean juice in there, and then top it with the dressing. And for some reason, my kids really loved this meal. You could add a salad very easily and put some dressing on that as well and have some more veggies. And there you go. It's very easy, takes very little hands-on time, and is very satisfying.
Oh, that's great. I will be adding that to our Instagram page so that other moms can see. And we always need more easy meals that are good for our toddlers because it can be hard sometimes to find meals that they enjoy. So thank you for sharing that. And to the audience, the women listening today, thank you so much for joining. I hope this was an encouragement to you. And I hope you have a good day, and thank you for listening. I hope that you were as blessed as I was during that discussion and also reading her book. I'm going to link it in the description below, or you can go to freegracepress.com and purchase one of their books. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe to wherever you listen to podcasts or YouTube, and we are also on social, Instagram and Facebook. And I hope you join us next time.